All right, thank you all so much for joining us this evening for this webinar, Beautify Your Farm with Native Plants. If you can, go ahead and keep both your video and your audio off during the presentation, that would be great. I'm just going to go ahead and leave mine on for a couple minutes here while I first get started, and then I'm going to turn it off as well to save on bandwidth and make our recording a little bit nicer and cleaner for all the folks that signed up for that. So tonight, both myself, Megan Ademeyer, and my coworker, Jen Bond, are going to be going through this webinar. I'll be doing the first portion, and then she will be hopping in on the second portion. And as I mentioned, this webinar will be recorded, and it will be available to all of you. So we will go ahead and send it out to everyone. So if you miss anything, know that there will be that recording you can go ahead and tune back into. Okay, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Oh, and also I did forget to mention, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put your questions in the chat box. We'll pause midway through to answer questions. And Jen, as we're going through the presentation, she will also be answering questions in the chat box as they come up, and she can. And then we will again at the end go ahead and answer all the questions in the chat box. All right, so a little bit about Clallam Conservation District. We're a local government organization, and we were created back around the 1950s to conserve natural resources. Pretty much every county throughout the United States has a conservation district, and we're just a great local organization that can help landowners and land users to really meet their natural resource objectives. So the Conservation District is governed by a 5-member board of supervisors. They're all volunteers, and 3 of them are elected and 2 are appointed. And we do currently have an opening for one of our elected supervisors. So if you're interested, you can go to our website. We have a page on elections, and you can learn a little bit more about what being a board of supervisors entails and how to apply for that position if you're interested in that. So the Conservation District helps land users protect and conserve the natural resources in Clallam County. So we're specifically focused on Clallam County. And all of our services are completely free of charge, other than soil testing, which does cost a fee just because we do send it off to a lab. But all of our technical assistance, answering questions, helping out landowners and users, that's all free. And we are non-regulatory, so we don't deal with permits or fees or anything like that. Everything is just to be able to help landowners and users manage natural resources. So we do have planners. Myself and Jen, we are both conservation planners, and we are available to make free, no obligation site visits to horse and livestock farms. And also, we just recently got funding to help out folks who have riparian areas, so streams that go through their properties. So we also have that as another piece that we can provide site visits to help folks with. And if you go to our website, we have a conservation on the farm and a conservation along the creek page on there. And both of them have a just a little button that you can click to request assistance, fill out a little bit of information about yourself and your property and what you're looking for, and we will get back to you with assistance if you fill that out. Or you're also welcome to give our office a call or email our email that's provided on the website as well. All right, so tonight we are going to cover the following. We're going to talk just in general about native plants. We're going to talk about some of the common native plants in our area and those that are oftentimes used on farms. We're going to look at the different benefits and uses for native plants in your farm. We're going to talk about where we can find native plants, how to plant them, how to protect new and existing plantings that you might have, and then also just a few slides on creating wildlife habitat on your farm. Okay, so native plants, why are they so important? So native plants are plants that have evolved specifically for our conditions in our area. So for our soil, our rainfall, our snowfall, all of that kind of stuff. And they're just very suited to our sites, whereas plants that are brought in that aren't native to our area, they might not be evolved completely for our growing conditions. So it's really great to try to plant native plants when they'll meet our objectives. Native plants are also great for providing food and shelter for wildlife. Most of our wildlife have adapted to use these native plants, so it's nice to really target those in to our native wildlife so that they have those plants that they're used to evolving with. They're a very important part of the ecosystem. And the really great thing about native plants is they typically don't need extra care to thrive, other than just some supplemental water during their first years of establishment. That isn't even completely crucial, but it can really help with establishment and mortality. But other than just that little bit of supplemental water, they don't need fertilizer, they don't need watering for their entire lives. So they really have much lower inputs than plants that aren't native to our area. So we're just briefly going to touch on the native trees and shrubs in our area. Our district manager, Kim Williams, she's giving a presentation tomorrow, actually a webinar from 10 o'clock to 11 o'clock that will go into much more detail on the native trees and native shrubs, where they grow best, how tall they grow, things like that. But we still wanted to just kind of quickly touch on some of the different species that we'll be talking about during the webinar tonight. So conifer trees, when we refer to those, they're trees that actually bear their seeds in cones. So that's sort of just what the conifer part means. And most of these conifer trees, and all of the ones actually that I have listed on this page, they all keep their needles year long. So we also refer to them as evergreen because they will keep that green color and keep those needles on the entire year. There are some species, some conifer species that do drop their needles during the year, so those wouldn't be evergreen, but the ones that we typically see in our area are evergreen. Most of these trees that are listed here, they grow up to 150 or even 200 feet. So these conifer trees that we're looking at, they do get very tall, with the exception of shore pine, which grows up to maybe 100 feet, kind of its maximum height. So if you're looking for lower growing conifer trees, shore pine would sort of be one of the only ones that would be sort of more lower growing of this list. But these do grow fairly slowly. So with the exception of Doug fir can grow up to about 2.5 feet per year. And of course, it really depends on your soil conditions. Some of these can grow, more quickly in areas such as the West End with higher rainfall as opposed to Sequim with lower rainfall. But for the most part, they're fairly slow growing. So if you put them in, they're not going to block a view or become a danger tree right away. It's going to take several decades for that to happen usually. So looking at these deciduous trees down here, and just to back up, deciduous means that these trees will lose their leaves in the fall. So they drop their leaves in the fall and then they begin to get them back in kind of the late winter, early springtime. And these down here, these deciduous trees, of these, only big leaf maple and red alder will get fairly tall. The rest of these will stay pretty short, about maybe 35 feet or lower. So deciduous trees can be a good way to get something larger growing on your farm without having the major height that the conifers will bring. The only problem with the deciduous trees is because they drop their leaves, you're not going to have that year-round color or that year-round screening that the conifer trees will provide. Okay, so now we're going to look at some of the common native shrubs in our area. Most of these shrubs are under 15 feet in height, so they're just sort of a great thing to be able to put in and not take up as much space as a tree. Let's see, the serviceberry, that can get up to about 25 feet, so it grows a little bit more like a short tree than it does a shrub. But again, it's going to take a little while to get there, and it's still not going to take up quite as much space as the trees that we mentioned. So in this photo here, I did just want to mention that you can see, it's a little bit hard to see. I hope it's big enough on people's screens, but you can see the barn back here. And right along the barn here is Matriotti Creek that goes through here. So this particular landowner had all these deciduous trees along here, but they're not doing that great of a job screening the barn and screening the farm activities. And so they actually decided they also wanted to plant a very good riparian area along Matriotti Creek. creek. So they decided to enroll in a program to help them plant all these trees and shrubs along the creek. And you can see a lot of these evergreen trees that are growing out here. So they're going to grow up and they're just going to provide a really great screen for this farm so that it kind of makes it, sort of separated from the neighbors and, keeps the activities and any like dust or things like that from going over into the neighboring properties. And it's going to create a wonderful habitat along Matriotti Creek for fish and amphibians and birds and things like that. So I just thought I'd point out this photo here. And since we did just briefly go into these native trees and shrubs, I did just want to refer you back to our website. We have a native plant page on our website. And if you go there, you can find details on all of these shrubs and trees, how tall they grow, where they grow best, the soil conditions, whether they need full sun or shade, also a little bit more on what they look like. So there's some great resources there. And again, that webinar tomorrow that Kim Williams is putting on, will go into more detail on these plants. So just, we thought we'd throw some slides in here just to sort of show some of the beautiful color that we can get with native plants, so that you can sort of have an idea of what you could put out there on your farm and how, beautiful they would look in places. So at the top here, we have mock orange, which just smells amazing. And this typically flowers from about May to June. So that'll give you some of this beautiful color kind of right at the beginning of summertime. Whereas red flowering currant, that usually blooms from about March to mid-May. So if you add these two together in a landscape, you're going to have a little bit longer flowering time on your farm, going from March kind of time frame with the red flowering currant out to June with the mock orange. We also have Nook rose here, which can sometimes flower out as late as July. It typically starts around May. So that just extends it a little bit further even. And Oregon grape, that typically flowers around April or May. So that'd be sort of in between when the red flowering currant and mock orange are blooming as well. And then with serviceberry, that also is about April, May timeframe. So you can have just this really beautiful color kind of starting out the spring and going in towards the summer with these. And there's definitely shrubs that are just as showy. We just didn't have enough room on the slide here, but we just wanted to show you how beautiful these native plants really can be. And all of these, except serviceberry, grow to about a maximum of around 10 feet. So again, they don't take up a lot of space in a landscape, but they can really show some great aesthetics for a farm. And just to do a close-up on red flowering currant here, this is just a way that someone incorporated into a landscape in a horse pasture. You can see there that they did use electric fencing to protect the actual base of the shrub itself. And, the shrub's just kind of growing outwards a little bit and growing into the pasture. This particular shrub is not poisonous to horses or livestock, so it's an excellent choice to use out in a pasture setting like this or alongside the edge of a pasture. So now we're going to look a little bit at our fall color. So we don't get the showy colors necessarily that maybe the East Coast and places like that get, but we do still get some beautiful colors, and it really depends on kind of how our fall season comes in and the temperatures that we get. But typically big leaf maple is always going to be one of those ones that just has gorgeous fall color. The big leaves that it has, the big stately tree, it's one that we find on old farms often because, people just plant one out in the middle of the pasture just to have that beautiful tree, growing out there and just looking gorgeous all through the year. Then we have red osier dogwood, which is another beautiful one for fall color. It gets that kind of reddish and orangish color that you see in the photo there. Vine maple is another just beautiful one. Gets fiery bright orange most falls. And then just down here in the corner, we have sort of some different plants all together with the different fall colors that we can see in our area. So wintertime, these deciduous trees and shrubs, they drop their leaves and they're not going to look quite as beautiful as they do the other 3 seasons. However, we still have some that do show some gorgeous color throughout the winter. This top one up here with this red, these bright red stems, that's red osier dogwood. And this is just a gorgeous one to have in a landscape because you're going to have that color all throughout the winter. I've even seen people make wreaths out of this because it's such a beautiful, beautiful plant to be able to do something like that as a base for a wreath. So that's kind of another thing that you can do with this plant. Native willows, those also can show some really beautiful kind of yellow color down here throughout the winter. And then here, one of my favorites that we can combine for winter color is snowberry and native rose. So you have the white berries for snowberry combined with these beautiful red rose hips in here, and it just makes a really, really lovely hedgerow. And that can be found in a lot of old farms alongside fences where that has become established, and it just has that really nice color throughout the winter. Okay, so now we're going to look at another feature that some of these plants have, which is the berries. All of these, this isn't an extensive list by any means. There's quite a few more that we're missing on here. Slough, that's another one. But some of these can actually be used for human consumption. Thimbleberry, that can be picked right off the vine and eaten. Other ones we might need to process in order for them to be safe for consumption, like serviceberry, Oregon grape, and the blue elderberry here. So not all of these that we're showing are fit for human consumption. So you want to always check and make sure before eating any of these, or picking any of them. We do have a publication on our native plant page on our website that gives photos of all these plants. And then at the bottom, it gives some of the traditional medicinal uses and other uses for them. So that's a resource that you can check. And of course, the internet's just a wealth of knowledge. Just make sure that you're, when you're eating any of these, that you really know that that source is credible. So the other great thing about some of these berries that are not fit for human consumption, such as red osier dogwood or black twinberry or snowberry, is that they're really great for wildlife. And a lot of these, like the snowberry we just looked at, they persist partway through the fall, winter, sometimes even into that kind of late winter, almost spring. So this just helps give that year-round wildlife habitat and food for wildlife that we really need for our native wildlife species around here. So just a few species that there is kind of a caution we wanted to point out with them is wild rose, especially Nootka, and also hawthorn. Those are ones you kind of want to be careful about where you put them because they can cause some injury to eyes. So for instance, like this horse here, this is rose that it's kind of nosing up to. And along a fence line, probably not too big of a deal, but where we have seen some injury, especially like in fact, on my farm, we have Herefords, and for some reason, when they get in some of that Nootka rose, it seems to scratch their eyes, and we've had worse time with pink eye in the years where we didn't go in and we didn't mow some of the wild rose down in the pastures. So that's just an instance of where it can kind of cause some physical damage to animals. And then wild rose can really start to get aggressive and get out into pastures. And you can keep it mowed down, but if you kind of back off on the mowing for a while, it really can sort of start to take over. So you just want to use caution where you're putting that in, but it's an amazing plant. And then also snowberry, that's another one that can make those fence lines a little bit difficult. It can be aggressive as well and kind of come out into the pastures and lead to some mowing that you need to keep it sort of at bay. And then some other species here that are listed that can be aggressive as well. Quaking aspen, Douglas spirea, not listed, are cottonwood and willow. These are all amazing species. They're great native plants, great for habitat, but they can just have some aggressive qualities to them where they can put up runners and just sort of, start with one and you end up with like 10 extra plants that you didn't intend on having. And it's fine if you have the space for it in the area. Just be careful where you plant these species, knowing that they might, really multiply and do it more quickly than some of these other species. The other thing to think about when you're planting native plants is, of course, toxic properties, where you're planting them in relation to horse and livestock being able to access them. So for instance, bitter cherry, Gary oak, rhododendron, those are all ones that you do not want your animals to have access to. There's also some in some of the pollinator mixes. So you got to be careful with some of those pollinator mixes. The lupin can be poisonous, and just really know what you're planting, before you're putting it out there, and make sure that they aren't poisonous. And if you have any questions about plants that are poisonous, we typically hold a workshop in kind of the May timeframe where we talk about poisonous plants, noxious weeds, things like that, specifically targeted to horse and livestock owners. And we do that in conjunction with Clallam County Noxious Weed Board. They do a great presentation for us. So make sure you sign up for our e-newsletter, and you can get information on upcoming presentations that we have on those kinds of things. Okay, so some plants resources here. This is an excellent book by Pojar and McKinnon, Plants of the Pacific Northwest Coast. We highly recommend this one. You can typically find it at the local bookstores. I mentioned that we're having an upcoming workshop tomorrow. It's planting and maintaining a native landscape. You can still sign up for that on our website. And that will be a webinar held tomorrow between 10 and 11 o'clock. So again, go over to our website if you'd like to sign up for that. And King County has a really excellent interactive plant search database. So if you go into like a search engine like Google and type in King County interactive plant database, that'll come up, and you can really get in there and research a lot of these plants that we may not have talked about today, and just get a good feel for what other options and what other plants are out there. Okay, so now I'm going to hop into some reasons to use native plants on your farm. So we've touched on quite a few of these things just in talking already, but just to kind of drive it home, they can really provide some great shade and shelter from extreme weather conditions for animals. So even if you have, large conifer trees outside of a fence line, a lot of times those branches over time, they're going to hang out over the edge of the fence, and they're really going to be able to still help shelter your animals from rain without having your animals, right next to the tree to damage it. And then also give them shade if you properly place them, where the sunlight isn't going to kind of beat down, and they're going to be in the right place to provide that shade for your animals. They'll also can help really minimize farm impacts, things like dust, even smell to a certain extent, but just things like that can impact surrounding neighbors that may not be, farming. They may not be farm friendly. Native plants can also help protect water quality from polluted runoff and sediment. So when you have them along things like a winter feeding area or a graveled paddock, things like that, they can really help protect water quality. They're great for a food source, not as much for us for human consumption. I mean, there's those few that we talked about, but really more for the wildlife value of them. And then they also can really help with flooding and water control. So the roots of these trees, the fact that they go down so deep into the ground, they can really help with getting water to kind of go down into the ground as well, instead of just sitting there ponded. So, you'll really get a sense for that if you have people, let's say, above you that log a hill slope or something, and then all of a sudden people at the bottom will get calls from them, gosh, I'm so much more wet than I used to be. I have all this ponded water. And really that can be a lot of it. These plants use a lot of water. They help get a lot of water down deep into the ground. So they can really help in drying up, some of these areas that have some kind of seasonal ponding or things like that. I mean, they're not going to dry it up completely, but they really can help get that water down into the ground. Okay, so some more reasons to use native plants in your farm is for natural pest control. Native plants can really help attract predatory birds, hawks, owls, and all of those really can help with rodent control. I mean, it's not going to be necessarily, helping with rodent control right inside of an enclosed barn, but just kind of keeping the rodents down outside of those areas can be a huge help. Also great for songbirds and bats, which can really help with insect control, especially mosquitoes. Bats eat a ton of mosquitoes. And then also amphibians, which can help, frogs, things like that. Those can really help with mosquito control and other insects. So you'll just, over time see some of these things that you didn't actually think about, that the native plants can really help benefit you by, sort of just quietly taking care of some of these problems you might have had. And another great reason to use native plants is to help enhance pollinator habitat. So native plants and native pollinators, they've naturally adapted over thousands of years. And we even have research that we have found that says that native plants are 4 times more likely to attract pollinators than non-native plants. So this is just an excellent way to be able to increase the amount of pollinators like birds and bees and other insects, things like that, to your property, to really help enhance the pollinator habitat there. And the Xerxes Society has some excellent information on pollinator habitat. So if you are kind of more interested in doing things, maybe like on the right here, where you're doing some more flowering type species, more forbs and things like this, they have some really good information on that. So I'd highly recommend checking out that link. And I believe we have that linked on our native plant page as well. So if you don't get it down here, we can either put it in the chat later if somebody needed it, or look at our native plant page and it might be there as well. Okay, so now that we delved into just native plants and some of the reasons behind them, where do you actually start? Where on your farm is a good place to just start incorporating some native plants in with kind of minimal impacts to what you're doing? And some of the great places to look are alongside streams or ditches or ponds, any waterways that you have kind of out on your property already, seasonally wet areas that aren't really providing that much value to your horses or your livestock in terms of feed. It's just a nice place to start. And then you can always go bigger, but at least you can kind of start in these unused areas to try to get a feel for it and see what you like, what you maybe don't like before jumping into other areas of your farm. Property lines, fences, and unused corners of the field, those are also really great places to just start incorporating a few native things in there. Of course, taking it into account that you want to make sure you're picking species that aren't going to impact your fences, that type of thing. So think about that when you're planting out there along fence lines and things, but those are another great spot to go ahead and pop some native plants in. And just to kind of elaborate a little bit more on planting along waterways, conifer trees are really excellent to put in along streams and ditches, especially. And conifer trees meaning evergreen conifer trees, ones that are going to keep their needles all year long and be able to provide kind of year-round shade to these streams and ditches. And they will help lower water temperature, which is very important for fish habitat and other amphibians. They'll help stabilize stream banks, reduce erosion. They also, this is one really, really huge selling point, is they can help shade out invasive weeds such as reed canary grass. So reed canary grass is that grass that it gets to be over head height and it just forms these thick clumps that exclude out any other vegetation. And if you can get these evergreen conifer trees planted in there, it can really over time help shade that reed canary grass out. And then it can also provide long-term woody debris for fish habitat. So way down the line, when these trees fall into the waterways, they just do excellent things for fish habitat. And really any wood that falls in the stream, alders, any of the deciduous trees, Anything like that is just so beneficial for fish habitat. So it's great to have really any vegetation that you can along streams, and to a certain extent ditches as well to lower those temperatures. So if you do have waterways on your property, we wanted to mention that we do have funding available to help with planting buffers along them. And a buffer is just basically some rows of trees and shrubs that buffer the stream, the waterway from your pasture. So you can see on this top photo here, there's a fence that's been installed, the horses in the pasture over here. The stream is kind of out here further towards these deciduous trees, and all these little white things that you see, those are plant protectors around trees and shrubs that have been planted to give that buffer between the waterway and your animals. And we have 2 funding programs available to help cover 100% of the costs of planting the trees and shrubs. We also have one of those programs which can help give landowners an incentive payment every year for planting these trees and shrubs along waterways. So if you're interested at all, feel free to contact us, and you can go ahead and fill out that assistance form I mentioned earlier that's on our Conservation Along the Creek webpage on our website if you are interested and want to just go that route for contacting us. So one waterway that you don't want to just go ahead and plant without checking with your ditch manager is an irrigation ditch. A lot of times they have easements along the irrigation ditch for maintenance. And so you need to make sure that in that area, they don't have an easement there so that they can get in and do maintenance. And if you plant something, it might create a little bit of trouble for them to do that. So we do have information on our Conservation on the Farm page with irrigation contacts for the different irrigation companies. There's a map in there if you're not sure kind of which company or district that you lie within. And that publication is called 5 Things to Know Before You Irrigate. So let's see, just a few notes on planting with wetlands and ponds is you want to be careful planting trees or shrubs on pond berms or dams. That can cause some leakage of the water that can, completely blow out a berm or a dam if those roots get in there and then the water starts to seep through. So be very careful planting around those types of areas. You also want to make sure you select native species that can tolerate wetness, kind of that year-round potential wetness. So you want to check the conditions that the native plants grow in. We do have quite a few native plants that grow really, really well, being wet most of the year. So look into that. And then also consider planting kind of clumps around these types of areas like the wetlands and ponds to provide cover and food for wildlife habitat. These areas can just support so much wildlife, and it's neat to be able to bring it to these areas and help control things like mosquitoes and invasive plants by using native plants to do that. Okay, so with that, I am going to turn it over to Jen. She's going to complete the rest of this presentation. So Jen, do you have control now? I just gave it to you.
Yeah, looks like I do. Okay. And I've been, I haven't seen any questions come in yet in the chat, so I'm going to turn that over to Megan. So if you have questions as we go, feel free to use the chat box and we'll try to answer them as we go. If not, we can try to open up some time at the end of the presentation to go over some questions. So, so with that, I'm going to talk just briefly about visual screens. So like Megan mentioned earlier, a lot of times farm operations have some less pretty areas, maybe areas where we have a lot of equipment parked or waste storage facilities. And so putting in a visual screen oftentimes is good for both the farmer and for neighbors. If you're in a situation where you do want to try to screen out an area of your property, you want to focus on conifers because that's going to give you the year-round greenery. And it's going to look kind of like a monotone. You can kind of use a variety of conifers. In this picture, we have it looks like Doug fir kind of along an open field. Some species do better, like Doug fir and grand fir, kind of in these open exposed areas. Other conifers like our spruce and our cedar, they're more understory plants, so they can sometimes struggle a little bit more to get established in these more open, sunny areas. If you want to add some interest, you can do kind of an inner row of something like Megan showed you earlier that's going to add some color. Spacing is really kind of up to you how densely you want to plant this. I mean, at a minimum, I'd say a 10 by 10 foot spacing for the trees, but you could even go, closer than that. It just may be that you have to come back into that screen as the trees get more mature and remove some of those trees if they are very close together. So the next thing I want to talk about are windbreaks and hedgerows. So these are strategic plantings using a variety of plants that are installed to kind of redirect the air and wind movement. It's obviously going to also provide some screening. It kind of defines areas. And these are, like Megan mentioned, made of native trees and shrubs that are going to also kind of enhance your wildlife habitat on the property. A lot of research has shown that these windbreaks and hedgerows are really important traffic corridors for local wildlife. So a lot of mammals, small and large mammals, will use these hedgerows and windbreaks to move kind of between areas of habitat. Also, they just, really add some natural beauty to properties. And then if you are a livestock producer, using windbreaks and hedgerows are going to help just, hopefully increase temperatures during the winter by cutting down on that wind and providing a little bit of relief from windy conditions. Thankfully, we live in an area of the country where we don't have real extremely cold winters, but what we do have is wet. And a lot of livestock, once they're kind of soaked to the bone, if you add wind to that, you can deal with some hypothermia and some health problems. So really, if you're in an area that's windy, a hedgerow or a windbreak will certainly help with that. So windbreaks themselves, you're going to want to use a combination of both conifers and deciduous trees and shrubs. So we're going for a varied height in this planting. At a minimum, you're going to want to have 2 staggered rows, typically 1 row of trees and 1 staggered row of shrubs. The 2 rows of trees can be spaced like 10 to 15 feet apart. But at least, have one of those rows be conifers, and then the shrub row can be spaced about 2 to 6 feet apart. This makes more sense when you look at a diagram and what we're trying to do. So you need to know where the prevailing wind is on your property. Most of us are getting wind from the northwest or west and north. And so, having kind of a feel for where the wind's coming on your property. Again, using conifers like Doug fir, grand fir, shore pine, Sitka spruce, western red cedar, and then some of those tall deciduous trees as well, like Megan mentioned, the big leaf maple, the red alder. One word of caution with the red alder: if this screen is an area near buildings or structures, you're going to want to be really cautious with that red alder, because it's actually a rather short-lived tree, and so it can drop a lot of branches. It can kind of die, and you'll have a lot of wind throw from the top and such. And so use caution with red alder if it's near anything where it's gonna break off and cause a problem. Okay, let's see here. So I may have skipped a slide. Hang on one second. I'm gonna back up a little bit here. Okay. So this slide kind of popped away before I had a chance to really talk about it. So once you know your prevailing wind direction, then you can kind of plan out how you want this windbreak to look. So you're going to have that, low growing shrub row, kind of that medium row and then a tall row of conifers and deciduous trees staggered. You'll notice that bottom diagram shows a minimum of about 100 feet between these windbreaks and structures. So kind of keep that in mind when you're planning out these windbreaks. So I'm going to go ahead and skip forward here a few slides. Bear with me. Okay. So this is just kind of an example. I wanted to show you some options. The upper left corner is Leland cypress, which is a non-native tree. It's very common throughout most of the county, but especially the eastern half of the county. The good is that it grows very fast. It's been, designed to quickly grow in areas. It's pretty resilient. It can grow in a variety of soil conditions and site conditions, and it can be pruned and hedged, but it's going to give you a more kind of formal manicured look. Whereas below you see more a row of native Doug fir and grand fir growing, and that's kind of more of a wild look. Some folks, Megan and I have been working on farms for many, many years, and the number one regret, I always ask folks, like, what do you wish you would have done differently or done sooner? And the number one thing I always have farmers say is that they wish they would have planted trees sooner. So so a lot of times, some folks are in a hurry and they want that immediate growth that Leland cypress offers, which, is great. The downfall of the Leland cypress is it's not a native plant and it's not really offering much in the way of habitat. Our local wildlife did not evolve with it. They don't utilize it like they would native conifers. One option is to go ahead and plant the Leland cypress row, leave yourself space, and then go ahead and make a couple other rows of native trees. Once those native trees are mature to a height that you're comfortable with, you can kind of come back in and remove that cypress row. So that is one option. And then up here in the corner, we have kind of a conifer row and then an inner shrub row. And so this, if you think about those photos that Megan showed you of, all the color and diversity that you can bring onto your property with shrubs, that's really another option to kind of add some interest and diversity and beauty on your farm. The next thing I'll kind of mention is down in this lower photo, you'll see that there's some power lines near those trees. So I wanted to just also mention that you really need to be very conscientious of power lines and the setbacks on your property. This diagram came from Clown County PUD, and it talks about the different setbacks that you need to have between power lines and even utility boxes. So again, this just becomes a safety issue when you're kind of planning and planting these properties, knowing how far back you need to be from power lines. The other thing to keep in mind too is, like Megan mentioned earlier, these trees have very aggressive roots. And so when you're looking at your property and your farm and figuring out where you can and can't plant, you want to make sure that you keep these trees away from septic drain fields. I get a lot of questions like how far, and it really kind of depends on the plant. But, at least 50 feet or more away from your drain field, because those roots can spread and creep down into drainage lines and cause a lot of issues that way. And the same goes with concrete. If you have concrete slabs or a concrete barnyard, you want to make sure you leave some space between these trees you're planting and those man-made structures that could be damaged by the roots. Okay, so hedgerows are similar to windbreaks, except that they're shorter and narrower than windbreaks. And so a lot of time hedgerows are kind of used to delineate between pastures or along a road. They may be planted in areas where there's restrictions as far as power lines go, or if you're lucky enough to have like a beautiful mountain view or a water view, you may want to avoid using those taller species that are going to block a view. And so shrubs really become a great option. And so as far as how closely to plant these shrubs, 2 to 6 feet apart, it really depends on how quickly you want this hedgerow established. If you're very impatient and you want to see results right away, then you could, do a 2 to 3 foot spacing. But you could go up to 6 feet. Some of these plants, like we've mentioned, snowberry and the rose, once established, they are very thicket forming, and they really will kind of fill in areas and fill in these voids. And again, picking some of those flowery plants like the mock orange, the red flowering currant, those really showy flowery plants are really, it's a great thing for pollinators. So if you're an orchardist or you have crops on your property and you're concerned about pollinators, certainly pick some of those showy flowery plants kind of on the inside. The other thing I was going to mention too is if you are growing an orchard or a garden or maybe row crops, and one of our limitations in our climate is just heat units in the summer. Most of our sun and our temperature comes from southern exposure. So if you are trying to grow crops, row crops, and orchards, you may want to avoid planting a very tall like windbreak or tall conifer row on the south side of your garden or orchard area. That's going to kind of shade that area that you're trying to, increase sunlight and increase heat units. So, it could be that a hedgerow would be a good option for the south side of a lot of your crop and orchard areas. This is just a list of some of the hedgerow species that grow very quickly. We kind of have some of these are very drought tolerant, which we'll get to in a few minutes about water and water requirements. And then some of them are more fast growing versus slower growing plants. But there's a lot of variety out there. And again, if you tune in to Kim Williams' talk tomorrow, she'll go into a lot of these details that kind of each of these plant species prefers. And that will help you pick a plant that's going to grow best for your site conditions. So on your property, we encourage you to get creative. So if you have like a riding arena, oftentimes those areas are very dusty. Also like pig pens, especially in the summer, we can be very dry in our livestock keeping areas. And so planting a hedge and some native vegetation around that can really help reduce dust for your property and for your neighbors. And then you can use these native plants, hedgerows and windbreaks to screen out kind of the less pretty areas on a farm, like manure storage areas or composting areas. So we've kind of gone through all the different things you can do on your farm, as far as native plants, but where do you get these native plants? And so there's every year there's more and more options as native plants kind of grow in popularity and as folks learn more about just the benefits of having natives on their property. So it is possible to find some at the local nurseries. These are usually potted stock. So these are more landscape grade, larger, more mature plants. You can collect and propagate some native plants on your own. You can take cuttings from mature plants and you can transplant seedlings. This works, well for some plants, but mostly smaller plants. In the conservation district, we have a native plant sale. It's a pre-order sale. It's underway right now. And these are bare root restoration grade plants. They're sold in bundles of 10, 25, and 50. We have a bunch of information on our website right now about the plant sale. This is a really great place to just find a variety of local, local native plants. So you can submit your order online. We have a few species that are sold out, but for the most part, most of them are still available through January 23rd, at which time the plant sale will end. The plants are available for pickup at the Lazy J Tree Farm the first Saturday in March. these are restoration grade plants. So these aren't, you know, landscape grade, but they're typically very healthy and, you know, a great way to easily add native plants to your farm and property. So although our plants come in the winter, really the best time to plant them is in the fall. Because they're bare root, we have to rely on a nursery to harvest them while the plants are dormant and while the weather is cold. So you have a couple options if you purchase plants through our plant sale. You can pot them up or heel them in once you get them that first weekend in March. Because really fall is actually the best time to plant them. So they can go in their permanent homes right away, but if you have the ability to pot them up, that's fantastic. You can see that planting in the fall, we're going to have an increase in the amount of precipitation that we're going to receive over October and November. And really, water becomes the main limiting factor with these plants. Regardless of if you plant them in the spring or if you plant them in the fall, for the first several summers, especially in mid to late summer, the more you can water these plants, the better they're going to do. Some of them will survive with no watering if they're in a really hard to get to area. You know, you're going to have some mortality, but maybe they'll pull through. But you can see that if you plant them in the spring, you know, we enter a period of time where the precipitation is really going to decrease. And it's just harder for those very young plants with very small roots to really get established enough to survive that July and August extremely dry period. So if possible, plant your plants or heel them into a temporary bed in the spring, and then go ahead and get ready to plant them in the fall. Oops, hang on. So there's some things that you should know. We have a very detailed brochure on planting on our website, and I've shared our native plant sale page with you all in the chat box. But these are just some of the things you want to avoid doing when you're planting your bare root plants. So if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, satisfactory, you want those roots free hanging. You want the, you know, not jammed in, gently tap down the soil around the plant to ensure that there's no air bubble. You want to avoid burying them too deep or too shallow. And adding some mulch around each planting is a really great way to help retain soil moisture and reduce competing weeds and grass. We could spend a whole hour just on planting. So, you know, I really do encourage you, if you're going to invest in the effort and time to, you know, plan out these hedgerows and windbreaks and areas on your property to plant, then, you know, read up a little bit on, you know, giving those plants the best possible chance of surviving and ensure you have a good plan for actually planting them. Once you have them planted, you know, there's some options for protecting those plants. There's tree tubes that you can purchase from different tree supply companies. Like in the center there is a tree tube you can purchase. We do have like voles, like field rodents that will, especially in a field planting on a farm, they'll go and they'll nibble the bark off around the base of the plant. And if they eat or chew all the bark off all the way around the plant, it's called girdling, and they more or less have killed that plant. And so putting some tree tubes can really help protect against these rodents. And also if you're out weed whacking, trying to reduce that competing vegetation around your plant, it'll also help protect it from accidental injury from the weed whacker. If you don't want to purchase tree tubes, you can make your own just using some flexible corrugated pipe that you can pick up at any home supply store. You just have to make sure that you really work the base of the tree protector, the pipe, into the soil so rodents can't get underneath the bottom of it. Megan has some good sources for tree protectors. Perhaps she can put them in the chat box as far as places that you can purchase the tree tubes. So if you're going to go that route, you know, there are some places where you can order them and have all the supplies on hand to install them as you're planting. So if you own livestock and you're planting trees and shrubs on your property, especially young trees and shrubs, you're going to need to protect them from impacts to livestock. So here's just some different options for ways you can protect your plants. A lot of folks have pretty good success with just doing like a no climb wire around the planting with a T-post to kind of hold things in. A lot of livestock, horses, sheep, hogs, cattle can be easily trained off of electric fencing. And so that's another option to like easily and inexpensively protect your new plantings. So if you have mature plants on your property, you do want to make sure, and you're keeping livestock in that area, you do want to make sure that your livestock are not causing harm to those plants. So, and I see it unfortunately quite often, some llamas and alpacas and horses and even cattle to a certain extent will kind of get into the bad habit of nibbling on the bark or peeling strips of cedar bark off the cedar. And that, again, just like those field voles, if they remove the bark, you know, all the way around the circumference of the tree, they will kill that tree. Our general recommendation is to protect the drip zone around trees. So think about when it's raining and the water's running off the branches and hitting the ground. You want to try to protect that area around each tree. If you know, are trying to discourage animals from laying directly on top of the roots under the tree, you know, don't prune up those lower branches. If you prune them up, then the cattle and other livestock are more likely to kind of get in closer to the tree trunks. So for fence maintenance, you know, thinking when you have these little tiny baby native plants you're planting, they're so tiny and cute, and you don't really think what they're going to look like in 30 years. But if everything goes well, that plant will be there long after you're gone. And so ensure that you're giving enough space between that plant and fencing. You can see in that bottom right corner, you have kind of the native vegetation has completely overtaken an old fence there. And that gets to be really problematic for maintaining that fence. So, you know, try to leave a barrier or a good gap between the fence and the plant, and try to think about how much space that plant is going to take at maturity. Perhaps it's a temporary fence like the upper picture that you can just move away as time goes by. You know, it seems like the best plantings I see on farms that I visit is leaving enough space that you can easily take like a riding lawnmower or a brush hog between the row of plants and the fence without damaging that row of plants. A lot of these native plants can be pruned and hedged back. So just like that previous slide I showed you of the Leland cypress that has that very manicured look, some of our plants, you know, you can prune and hedge back, things like ocean spray, a lot of the Nootka rose, and even the snowberry to a certain extent can be pruned and hedged. But a lot of the conifers and the deciduous, really you can't do that with. So you do want to try to have more of a setback on those plants. Especially if you have electric fencing, it's kind of an ongoing battle to keep fencing hot around here. So trying to reduce the amount of branches and vegetation, touching that will really help. So I'm going to briefly just run through wildlife tips. You know, there's a lot of opportunity for us as farm managers and property owners to try to ensure that we're sharing our property with all the wildlife that are out there. A lot of the wildlife, like Megan mentioned, are actually doing us some big favors. So, you know, trying to incorporate some things in that they need are super helpful. So, you know, if you have leaves, just go ahead and leave them. You don't need to rake them up. You know, those thin layer of leaves are not going to damage pastures or grasses. If you decide that you are going to rake them up, in a pile, just, you could leave them in a pile. You don't have to do anything with them, or you can use them as mulch around your trees. So leave the leaves.
Oh, Jen, are you still there?
I am.
Okay.
So brush piles. Brush piles are provide a lot of habitat as well to amphibians and reptiles and small mammals. Really easy to do as you're cleaning up after a storm. Go ahead and pile branches around the property. You can crisscross kind of some larger material on the bottom with some smaller material on the top. So this is a really easy way to provide some excellent wildlife habitat on your property. We talked a little bit about natural predators that are helping on our farms, and bats are one of those good guys that we want to try to encourage. So one bat can consume up to 2,000 mosquitoes in a single night. So really great to try to encourage bat habitat. A simple way of doing that is to buy or build a bat house. There's a lot of different designs available on the web. But they like the houses about 12 to 15 feet off the ground. Just another really cool option, especially if you can get bats to hang out at your property. It will really help with the amount of mosquitoes you're dealing with. Okay, so that kind of brings us to the end here. So as Megan mentioned earlier, we routinely make farm visits. If you've kind of sat through this presentation and, think, gosh, I don't even know where to start. I've got livestock and a stream and I could really use some advice. One of us would be glad to come out and walk that property with you and offer up some suggestions. So with that, I think I'll go ahead and open it up to any questions that we might have. Megan, did we have any come in the chat box?
Sorry, yes, we did, but I couldn't respond to any of them because every time I seem to do that, it would make a mess of your screen since you have the control. So I'm sorry about that.
No, it's okay. It's no problem. I realized partway through that we were trying to share a mouse and that wasn't going to work very well.
No, it wasn't. So I apologize for that. So looking through now, thank you, Donna, for the kind words that you enjoyed this webinar. So Leslie, the difference between wild roses and nook rose, no difference. I apologize. I was calling them wild roses because we have 3 species in Clallam County. We have bald tip rose, wood rose, and nook rose. And nook rose is probably our most commonly seen rose. I would say it is the most aggressive as well. So there are those different options, the bald tip rose and the wood rose, which are both equally beautiful. They grow pretty similar habitats. Wood rose kind of likes a little bit more shade, but any of those wild roses are just excellent for habitat. Nook rose is just also easier to find, it seems like, to purchase as well. And then Leslie, how much water do you need to get them established? Just the first year, or is it necessary to water them? So we typically recommend when you're planting bare root trees, such as the ones through our plant sale, that you do try to water them if you can for the first 2 to 3 summer seasons during those dry times that we get. And it's not a lot of watering. It's usually just once or twice a month that we recommend, but we do suggest to do very deep watering. If you just do sort of a surface watering where only the top couple inches get wet, that doesn't encourage the plants to get their root systems down really deep. So if you really dump, like an entire 5-gallon bucket on them or even more, that just helps the water go down much deeper, and it also helps those roots to get down deep. Now, that said, on all of our riparian plantings, we don't water those. They are closer to waterways, so they're probably getting a little bit more moisture out of the soil than like the middle of a very dry, barren pasture. But it is good to go ahead and get some water if you can, but it's not going to completely kill everything if you can't. You're just going to have a lot higher mortality if you're not able to get a little bit of water on them.
If you can get mulch on, especially if they're plantings where you're not sure you're going to be able to easily get back and water, or maybe you're only going to be able to water once or twice over the summer months, mulch really does make a difference. If you have a livestock operation or horses and you have bedding, or shavings that you're using, getting that out and using that around the plants will really help retain just what little moisture there is during those excessively dry months.
And actually, speaking of material that we have on farms, it's, a lot of people will use like composted manure, and composted manure is probably fine, but it is good to know that these native plants don't need extra fertilizer. So it isn't always doing them a favor if we do put on, like, let's say a mound of, horse manure or something like that, because what can happen is if they have those nutrients and those nutrients are sort of like close to the surface, their roots oftentimes won't go down super deep. So with these native plants, just getting them a little bit of water and then some mulch, like Jen mentioned, that really is about all they need. Let's see, we have a question about why should we not plant on the berm around the pond? And so with berms, a berm, by definition of a berm means sort of like a raised mound of dirt. And so if you have a pond, that the berm is actually what is holding the water in and keeping it from, seeping out or flooding out even into neighboring areas, then putting larger trees, even some of the shrubs that will have larger root systems on it, it can really jeopardize the berm by having those root systems in the berm. So especially with a tree, if that tree tips over, it's going to take all that soil with it, with its root system on that berm, and then your berm can fail. So you just have to be really careful what you do plant on berms, knowing how big the root systems are. Some of the shrubs, depending on what style berm you have, might be all right. But again, it's just sort of like a site specific thing. And we just wanted to make sure people knew to kind of use large plants, these native plants around berms with caution. Uh-oh. Jen, did the screen go away?
It just went black, but we're still here.
Okay. There we go. Sorry about that. There seems to be a little bit of glitches here and there. Let's see, the Latin name for the locally native wood rose. Oh gosh. It's on the tip of my tongue, but let me see if I can find it.
While Megan's looking that up, I'm just going to plug the Pojar and McKinnon book that we mentioned earlier, plants of the plants of the Pacific Northwest coast. If you have any interest in native plants, this book is absolutely fantastic. It talks about the common things like site conditions, growing conditions, but then it also really kind of does a deep dive into indigenous uses, native, the Latin name, where the names originate from. So it's a fantastic book, especially if you're new to the area and you're just trying to get a handle on all the native fauna out there. That book is the Bible for native plants in our area for sure.
Okay, so woods rose is Rosa woodsy. So I will actually put this into the chat here so that I don't butcher the spelling. And then I will also, since I couldn't do it while Jen was presenting, I will put in the name of the place that we recommend. We have great luck with folks going through PAC Forest Supply to get plant protectors and any kind of wildlife damage protection. That's where we actually get our plant protectors for all of our riparian sites. There's definitely other companies, but we just had some really great luck with them. So they've been wonderful to work with. Okay, do we get all the questions?
I don't see any other questions coming in.
All right, well, gosh, with that, then I think we can wrap it up. Thank you guys all so much for coming and participating live. It's wonderful to have a live audience. And like we mentioned before, we are recording this. So if anyone wants to go back and watch it, we will email you a link, and we will also have a link to it on our website under past events. And we do have some other really good webinars on our website under the past events. So be sure to check those out as well. And hopefully you all might be able to make it to tomorrow's presentation on native landscaping from 10 to 11. All right, thank you all.
Fantastic. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Bye-bye.